Dreams have a way of igniting the soul, don't they? They're the quiet whispers that wake us before dawn, the driving force that keeps us going long after the world has gone to sleep. For one young man, his dream wasn't just a passing fancy or a fleeting desire, it was his very heartbeat. The NFL, those 3 letters defined his existence. Every drop of sweat, every ache in his body, every sacrifice he made was a brick laid on the path to that goal. From punishing morning runs under the still dark sky to endless drills that stretched late into the night. His dedication was relentless. Football wasn't just a sport, it was his identity, his sanctuary, his proof to the world that he was meant for something greater. But life, in its unpredictable wisdom, had a plan that neither he nor anyone else could have foreseen. It wasn't just a plot twist, it was a collision course with faith, a moment designed to break him open and reveal a deeper, more profound purpose. Imagine waking up at 4 in the morning, the world still cloaked in darkness, and lacing up your sneakers to run 2 miles to a fire station and back. This wasn't just discipline, it was obsession, devotion. This young man's dedication to football was his identity. He practiced endlessly, even tossing a football to the ceiling at night, catching it in every possible way, preparing for the interceptions and catches that would make him a star. Every moment of his life was tied to his singular goal, making it to the NFL. And he was close, so close, just 10 games away. With official paperwork declaring him a projected top 30 draft pick, his path to success seemed inevitable. All the sacrifices and struggles of growing up in a 2-bedroom house shared by 14 people were about to pay off. But then, life stepped in. It was a moment like any other, a split-second decision on the field, a routine tackle etched into muscle memory from years of practice. But this time, something went horribly wrong. The collision was fierce but not unusual. It wasn't the kind of hit that drew gasps from the crowd. Yet, as soon as his body made contact, something felt off. His limbs betrayed him, going limp as though someone had flipped a switch. Panic mixed with confusion as he tried to draw a breath, but the air seemed to abandon his lungs entirely. Flat on his back, staring at the expanse of sky above, his world began to shrink. Teammates hovered over him, shouting words of encouragement, "Get up, man. We need you." But he couldn't. A chilling wave of numbness radiated through his body, leaving him unable to move. Unable to even feel. His mind raced to explain the situation. Was it just a stinger? A bad bruise? Deep down, a gnawing fear began to set in. This was no ordinary injury. When the ambulance arrived, he was placed on a spine board, immobilized, as the paramedics worked urgently. He caught fragments of conversations around him, words like no pulse and critical. His father stood nearby, trying to mask his worry with words of encouragement. "You got this, son." But even his father's voice wavered with unspoken fear. In the sterile brightness of the hospital, the truth was laid bare. The diagnosis hit like a thunderclap, a ruptured subclavian artery. He was bleeding internally, his life hanging by a thread. The surgeon's words were stark and unrelenting: "If we don't operate now, you won't make it through the night." Years of sweat, sacrifice, and dreams now boiled down to this one fragile moment, a battle between life and death. As he was wheeled into surgery, uncertainty loomed like a heavy fog. Would he wake up to see tomorrow? The morning after the surgery, the NFL, the goal that had once loomed so large, suddenly seemed small, insignificant even. This young man was alive, but his football career was over. The dream he had built his identity around was gone. It was a bitter pill to swallow. Friends and family, full of sympathy, tried to console him, but he felt lost. "Man, you messed it up," he thought to himself. "This was the only thing you ever wanted." Yet in that stillness, as his physical body healed, his soul began to wrestle with deeper questions. What happens when God says no? How do you find meaning when the one thing you lived for is stripped away? In the stillness of recovery, with the roar of the football stadium replaced by the hum of hospital monitors, his perspective began to shift. The dreams that once loomed so large in his life, the NFL, the accolades, the life he envisioned, now seemed small against the vastness of what God was unveiling. The initial pain of his loss, both physical and emotional, gave way to an awakening. He had confined God to his own ambitions, treating him like a means to an end, rather than the architect of a greater story. It was in those moments, lying in a hospital bed with a paralyzed arm and an uncertain future, that he began to truly listen. As C.S. Lewis so profoundly wrote, God shouts in our pains. The injury was not an end but an invitation, a megaphone calling him to a purpose far beyond anything he had ever imagined. The life he thought he wanted was just a shadow of the life God was preparing him for. The realization struck him deeply. His identity had been tethered to the wrong things. Football had been his everything, his validation, his measure of worth. And now, stripped of it, he was finally able to see what God had been trying to show him all along. His worth didn't come from achievements or success but from being a child of God, crafted for a divine purpose. As days turned into weeks, his prayers began to change. They were no longer desperate pleas for a return to his old life but bold declarations of trust in God's sovereignty. Lord, use me, he prayed. And slowly, he began to see his injury as a blessing. It wasn't just about him anymore, it was about what God could do through him. His pain became a testimony, his struggle a bridge that connected him to others who were searching for hope. What he once saw as a tragedy was now his calling, to live a life that reflected God's love, power, and purpose, even when the road didn't lead to the NFL. His life became a living testimony, a sermon played out in action rather than words. Each day, he faced the world not with bitterness or regret but with a quiet resolve that spoke volumes. His paralyzed arm, once a painful reminder of what he had lost, now became a powerful symbol of what he had gained: faith, perspective, and a deeper understanding of purpose. It wasn't the NFL that defined him anymore, it was the way he chose to rise above his circumstances, pointing to a God who redeems even the most broken stories. The ripple effect of his transformation began close to home. His father, a man who had once kept faith at arm's length, couldn't deny the power of what he saw in his son. The steadfastness, the hope, the unshakable trust, it was undeniable. For years, his father had resisted the idea of surrendering his life to Christ, but seeing his son's unwavering faith, even in the face of loss, softened his heart. One day, with tears in his eyes, he knelt and gave his life to God. His mother, already a woman of faith, found her trust in God reaching new depths. She had prayed fervently for her son's safety and success, and though the outcome wasn't what she had imagined, she saw God's hand in every detail. Her prayers became not just for her family's needs but for their ability to trust in God's perfect will, no matter the circumstances. Even his former teammates, those who had gone on to fulfill the dream he once shared, were profoundly impacted. They had known him as a fierce competitor, a man who was all about the game. Now they saw a different man, one whose identity wasn't tied to a jersey or a contract but to something eternal. One by one, they began to ask questions, seeking the same peace and purpose they saw in him. Some of them, men who had spent years chasing worldly success, found salvation through his story. His influence didn't stop there. Strangers who heard his testimony, people he had never met, were moved to re-examine their own lives. They saw in him a resilience that couldn't be faked, a faith that couldn't be shaken, and they realized that if God could work so powerfully through his pain, then perhaps he could do the same in their lives. It became clear that his injury wasn't a setback, it was a divine setup for something far greater. His story wasn't about loss but about the incredible ways God can use our struggles to bring others closer to him. Through his brokenness, countless lives were being made whole. One day, standing backstage at an event, he felt the same adrenaline he once experienced before running onto the football field. It was then he knew he was exactly where God wanted him. His purpose wasn't confined to the NFL, it was far greater. He was now playing a different game, one where the stakes were eternal. Life has a way of throwing us into the unexpected, confronting us with questions that pierce the very core of our beliefs. When everything you've worked for crumbles, when the path you've paved is suddenly blocked, it's natural to ask, why, God? But the real test comes in what follows. Do we cling to trust? Or do we let despair take root? This man's journey is a living reminder that our deepest trials often carry the seeds of our greatest transformations. When God says no, it's easy to misinterpret it as punishment or neglect. But as this man discovered, it's often an act of divine love, a redirection to something far more meaningful than what we could have ever imagined. His shattered dreams of the NFL weren't the end of the story, but the beginning of a new one that revealed God's bigger picture. Romans chapter 8:28 stands as a cornerstone of this truth, and we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love Him, who have been called according to His purpose. This verse became more than just words to him, it became his reality. God wasn't abandoning him, He was reshaping him, using his story to touch lives in ways a football career never could. Through the loss of his dream, he found a calling. Instead of running plays on the field, he now speaks into the hearts of others. Instead of scoring touchdowns, he helps others find their faith. His life became a testimony to the fact that God doesn't waste pain. He uses it to refine us, to draw us closer, and to make us instruments of His purpose. And so, the question extends to all of us: will we stay faithful when life's storms rage? Will we trust God's hand when His plan doesn't align with our own? If this man's story teaches us anything, it's that the no we fear might just be God's way of leading us to a yes far beyond our dreams, a yes that carries eternal significance and profound joy. Today, he lives not for applause or accolades, but for the impact he can make in the lives of others. Every day, he prays boldly, thankful that his relationship with God isn't built on circumstances but on trust. When asked if he would change what happened to him, he said no. His injury wasn't the end of his story, it was the beginning of a new one written by God's hand. The question lingers in the air, demanding reflection: what will you do when God says no? It's not a hypothetical question, it's one that each of us will face. Often more than once. The answer doesn't lie in grand gestures or perfect faith, but in the quiet, steadfast choice to trust Him, even in the midst of uncertainty. To trust God when life is smooth is easy. But when the road twists and turns, when the things we thought were certain unravel, faith becomes a test of endurance. It's in those moments that we are called to step out into the unknown, not because we see the path ahead, but because we know the one who guides it. As C.S. Lewis reminds us, while we can't rewrite the past, we can choose to live differently starting today. We can choose to align our lives with God's purposes, trusting His hand to write a story that exceeds our own expectations. This man's story doesn't end in sorrow, it ends in hope. The very no that could have defined his defeat became the foundation of a legacy. His life inspires others to lean into God's plans, not as a last resort but as a first response. He shows us that faith isn't just about believing when the answer is yes. It's about holding on when God's answer is different than what we prayed for, knowing that His vision for our lives is far greater than anything we can see. So, as you consider your own journey, ask yourself, what will I do when God says no? Will I let it stop me, or will I see it as an invitation to grow? God's plans are not just better, they're perfect. Let today be the day we stop resisting and start trusting, the day we let go of our own blueprints and embrace the masterpiece He's creating in us. In the end, it's not about what we achieve but about who we become in the process, reflections of His love, grace, and unshakable purpose.